All right. We've got a good number of participants in attendance here. Just for some housekeeping points, I'm Dr. Nick Kapustin. I'm the chair of our conservation program and also veterinarian at the Greenville Zoo. And we have started these virtual lectures due to the pandemic a couple, 3 years ago. And they turned out really well for us because it's easier to get speakers to participate. And we can also have the recordings of the sessions so people can tune in later or hear again some of the talks. And so that's a nice feature. On occasion, we do have talks that we do in person. We get speakers in. We we do have a good number of these lectures recorded, and they are available on our lecture webpage on our Greenville Zoo website. So look for those. And we have a couple more too, I think, that we'll be adding in the near future that we've had to edit. Some additional housekeeping points for you all is I do have you all muted and the video off just so we can maintain that for city policies as we're recording, and we'll make the recordings available. The the questions you may have as the talk progresses, go ahead and put them in chat. And at the end of the lecture, which will be about 45 minutes, I'll go through the questions and ask our speaker. And if we don't get to everybody, we'll see what we can do to try to maybe get some answers to you in the near future. And so now I'm pleased to introduce our speaker from Polar Bear International. It's Kayla McCurry, who has a number of years in zoo-based education regarding natural history of all sorts of species, and she's got a focus on polar bears with a special interest. So she's been able to participate in global conservation outreach programs on polar bears for PBI for a number of years, and is also very active on the governing council of the National Network for Ocean and Climate Change Interpretation. It's quite an acronym. It's NACI. Kayla can correct me. Where there all sorts of solutions are proposed and advocated for climate-based changes, for habitat for polar bears, as well as their benefit for survival, any threats that they may have. She'll talk about the threats polar bears are facing. She'll talk a little bit about their natural history and their habitat and what we all can do to help keep polar bears in everybody's life in one way or the other. So thank you for joining us, Kayla, and take it away.
Great. Thank you so much, Nick. Yeah, I'm Kayla McCurry. I'm the Conservation Outreach Manager for Polar Bears International, and I'd love to talk to you briefly just about the work of PBI, is what we call ourselves for short. As Nick mentioned, some polar bear ecology and the sea ice ecosystem that they're dependent on, and then, of course, the threats and how we can address those threats together. First thing, I'll share my screen with you here. While we're working to ensure the long-term survival of polar bears, we're of course working to keep polar bears and people safe in the short term as well, because we see this iconic species roaming the sea ice for generations to come. I'd love to start by just showing a real short video, sort of introducing you to Polar Bears International and a little bit about us and what we do.
Polar bears are just magnificent animals. By conserving the sea ice and by protecting polar bears, ultimately, we're protecting all living things on Earth, including ourselves.
Polar Bears International is unique in that we're the only nonprofit dedicated exclusively to polar bears and the Arctic sea ice they depend on.
Polar Bears International exists to make sure that polar bears exist, from the conservation to the research to the education to the outreach. And all of it is oriented towards the goal of better understanding and protecting the species.
We all know the overarching threat is climate change and sea ice loss. We hit that head on largely through communication and outreach, inspiring people to talk about climate change and to take actions on that front.
The absolute best thing is being able to show students around the world their first polar bear. You know, we're teaching them this love of the Arctic, but they're also able to make connections to what's going on in their own backyards and in their day-to-day lives. Polar Bears International conducts our own research and also supports research around the Arctic. Collaboration and creativity are core values in everything we do, and so we've been able to move a lot of very important research forward.
We continue to inform the best policy possible, factoring in the latest climate science as well as conservation expertise to protect polar bears.
The polar bears roaming around out here on the sea ice don't know that their world is disappearing, but we do. And every one of us can play a role to assure that polar bears survive so they can be appreciated as part of this Arctic environment into the future and always.
We hope you're inspired by the bears and the Arctic ecosystem they call home. By investing in polar bears' future, we're investing in humanity's future and leaving a legacy for generations to come.
So our work, we kind of think of it in 4 pillars: advocacy and policy, human bear coexistence, education and outreach, and field research. For advocacy, really from COP to supporting regional and national policy, PBI works to provide electeds with the latest in polar bear science and data, as well as supporting information that they and the general public need to make informed decisions. When our coexistence work in the Arctic, conflict between polar bears and people is on the rise and expected to increase as sea ice habitat shrinks. In regions with large summer sea ice loss, polar bears are becoming more frequent visitors to land and staying for longer periods of time. At the same time, human activity is increasing in the north. Without careful planning and management, tragic outcomes are inevitable for both polar bears and people. Protecting a future for polar bears obligates us to help people living and working in polar bear country to stay safe. Education and outreach is a huge part of our work as well. We're committed to education as part of our vision to ensure polar bears roam the sea ice for generations to come. Though our home office is in Bozeman, Montana, where there's not a lot of polar bears, and I'm calling in today from Portland, Oregon, where also there's not a lot of polar bears, PBI was born on a tundra buggy outside of Churchill, Manitoba, the polar bear capital of the world. And we have a public-facing interpretive space there called PBI House, in Churchill that further increases our impact, interacting with thousands of visitors each year through their 3 key tourism seasons. And right now, it's just the start of Aurora Borealis season. People are flocking to Churchill to see the northern lights. In the summer, about 4,000 beluga whales come into the Churchill River estuary to molt and have their babies. And there's visitors come to see beluga whales. And then in the fall, it's polar bear season, where polar bears are gathering along the shores of Hudson Bay waiting for the sea ice to return. So PBI House welcomes visitors and offers tours, community presentations. It's also a free convening space for the community. There's sewing groups there every week, AA meetings, cooking classes. It's a space available for the community to use however they'd like. Another part of the world that hosts visitors really engaged in the polar bear story is in Longyearbyen, Svalbard, Norway. We had this pop-up dome that we started just a couple of years ago in 2023 as a seasonal interpretive center. After a successful trial run, we opened it both in the spring and summer last year, and this year we'll have it open for 3 months in the summertime. There's a lot of cruise operators that move through the fjords in Longyearbyen. And then all of the outside of the island of Svalbard. And so field ambassadors and early career scientists have the opportunity to continue to share the polar bear story and shed light on one of the most vulnerable times of year in the polar bear cycle, the denning period. And there's a lot of polar bear denning that happens on Svalbard. And also talk about climate impacts in this population of bears. In addition to these interpretive centers, we offer free webcasts, teaching and learning materials, and have classroom activities. So teachers and students can follow their curiosity and be inspired to make a difference. So if you're an educator or you're looking to add some polar bears to your classroom, or an informal educator looking for activity ideas, don't hesitate to reach out. We'd love to connect with you. And then lastly, field research. As leaders in polar bear research, we commit to supporting field projects and groundbreaking studies that help to inform conservation efforts. We work with partners in science, technology, and media on projects across the Arctic, as well as zoos and aquariums, bears and human care, with a focus on polar bear conservation. Our ongoing research inspires action, adds to our understanding of polar bears, and brings hope to people who believe it's not too late to make a difference. And some of this foundational science and zoo-based conservation research has really helped to move forward the fieldwork and create advances that we really wouldn't have been able to do outside of like a zoo-based conservation or animal and human care environment. One example that you can kind of see on the bottom there, it's called a burr on fur tag. And you're probably very familiar with like a traditional radio collar that goes around the animal's neck, or an ear tag collar that will broadcast a short-term signal. You've got about a 7-month battery. But that's a permanent fixture. Burr on Fur is a program that was developed partnering with 3M, who you might be familiar with. They make Post-it notes and Velcro and such. We're like, you're really good at sticking things to other things. Would you work with us on a less invasive polar bear tag? And so they kind of did an idea sprint, and the product is like a plastic tag with a cover, and you use like an oversized pipe cleaner and really mat up the polar bear's fur in a less non-invasive way to be able to fix a collar, a transmitter to the polar bear's fur. They kind of do it right between their shoulder blades. And zoo bears actually tested those for us and for the researchers, and they were able to be iterative and make improvements. And so we're really grateful to the zoo and aquarium community who has supported this kind of work to help polar bears in the wild. Those burr on fur tags have been deployed, and we're seeing great returns, meaning that researchers are able to get new information and insights on bears who they wouldn't be able to previously. I can't collar a male polar bear because their neck is bigger than their heads. So being able to lean on these innovations really help to broaden that data set. I'm going to share one of our storytelling tools here as a transition, another quick video. This way, one of the ways that we share polar bear story and our work is through the inspired use of media. When we're in the field, we're always thinking as a team what new assets we can gather for publication, but also to use for curriculum, for virtual connections, highlighting STEAM jobs for classrooms, etc. So as part of this transition, here's a video of a sizzle reel from our work on maternal dense monitoring in Svalbard, Norway.
Is that better?
So projects like that allow us to, in that instance, they're setting up remote cameras to monitor den emergence from polar bears who are in the den. Hard to locate dens because they're buried under the snow. But thanks to our partners at the Norwegian Polar Institute, we're able to have collar data to get a better sense of where those dens are likely at. Early den emergence footage, like the footage here, can really provide researchers with valuable information. What's the mother's body condition like when she emerges? How many cubs does she have? What are their body condition like? How long did they stay in and around the den site. Really helpful information to share as northern communities expand to avoid disturbance in this crucial and vulnerable time of a polar bear's life. And sometimes they're very curious about the camera equipment and investigate it, even though it's set up a couple hundred meters away from their den. You can barely see the den opening there in the hillside in the distance. But also this baby polar bear is very cute. So now that you know a little bit about PBI and the work we do, I'd love to spend some time talking about the bears, where they live, how they survive in their habitat. You probably, as animal lovers, are a little more familiar with polar bears than the average person, but we'll talk a little bit about their ecology. So the Latin name for polar bears means sea bear, Ursus maritimus, not because they never go on land, but because they derive the vast majority of their food from the ocean and spend much of their lives on top of the sea ice. And they're completely dependent on the ocean for their survival. Scientists estimate there are roughly 20 to 25,000 polar bears throughout the Arctic. 2/3 of them live in Canada, and they're listed as vulnerable on the IUCN's Red List and threatened under the U.S. Endangered Species Act. The biggest threat to polar bears is habitat loss due to climate change, because their habitat is the ice on top of the ocean. And when that shrinks, their habitat shrinks. While this isn't the only threat to polar bears, commercial activity, human bear conflict like unregulated tourism, poaching or overharvesting, pollution and disease, those all pale in comparison to the impacts of climate change. So we're going to talk a little bit about some of the cool adaptations that polar bears have to thrive in this intense habitat. So let's start by talking about where they live. So what is this? This is not the view of the world that I grew up looking at, but it is how polar bear scientists think about polar bear range. We're looking at the very top of the planet, the circumpolar north. This includes the 5 countries where polar bears live: Canada, Greenland, Norway, Russia, and the US and Alaska. So polar bears are the world's largest non-aquatic predator. As I mentioned, they're considered a marine mammal in the US and are protected under the Marine Mammal Protection Act. Polar bears almost exclusively eat seal blubber. Ice seals like ringed and bearded seals make up the majority of their prey in most areas. They'll also feed on walrus, small whales, or scavenge on carcasses if it's available. While polar bears will also eat birds, bird eggs, reindeer, and other land-based foods when it's available to them, energetic modeling tells us that these foods are unlikely to provide enough calories for successful reproduction. Polar bears are big. They need a lot of energy to power this big body and frame, which in of itself is an adaptation for survival in this harsh environment. Male bears can be up to 1,200 pounds. They're sexually dimorphic in this way that female bears are much smaller than adult male bears. Larger bears do occur, but they're pretty exceptional. It's not uncommon for females to wear like about 300 kilos in the autumn as they enter the dens. There have been male bears up to 1,500 pounds, but 1,200 is a pretty, for the higher end of what we typically see. They can also be really long and very tall. When they're standing on their hind legs, adult male polar bears can dunk a basketball. They can be over 12 feet tall. And they're perfectly adapted for this Arctic ecosystem where they live. They're a vital part of that ecosystem and really a charismatic symbol of the North. In the Arctic, temperatures can get to -50 Fahrenheit in the winter and stay that way for days or weeks at a time. But polar bears are really built for these conditions. From their fur to their skin to their paws to their claws, their physique is designed to protect them from the cold, to hunt seals, and to dominate in the Arctic. We know that they're really uniquely adapted for this, so let's take a look at some of those key features. Firstly, their coat. Their polar bear's fur is well adapted for cold, and it's white to blend in with their surroundings. They have 2 layers of fur that prevent almost all heat loss when they're on land or on the ice. In fact, the fur keeps them so warm that adult males can quickly overheat if they start to run. Now, that 2 layers of fur, the bottom one is kind of like a woolly, furry undercoat that's like us wearing a sweater. And then they have guard hairs on the outside, which are more like a rain jacket. Those working together provide incredible insulation when they're dry. And some people are surprised to hear that their fur isn't actually white. It just looks that way. Each hair shaft is pigment-free and transparent with a hollow core that scatters and reflects the visible light. However, when the bear swims in the water, their coat doesn't really provide the same insulating properties. And we'll talk a little bit about how they stay warm in the water. That is thanks to their fat. They have a thick fat layer, and it's critical to their survival. Now, this thick fat layer is sort of like an energy storage bank and provides a couple of different really important benefits for polar bear survival. Firstly, it provides insulation against the cold, even when their fur is wet. So if they go for a swim, this thick fat layer is really more similar to our adipose tissue than to seal blubber, which is their favorite food. It helps to sustain them, providing a calorie reserve when the bear can't eat, and especially important for female bears who nurse their young with fat-rich milk, up to 30% milk fat. When you think about the milk that we pull out of the carton in our fridge, it's like 1 to 3% milk fat. Females are nursing their young with this rich milk while they have gone without eating for up to 8 months. So they're really incredible mothers. And this metabolism of fat also results in a source of metabolic water for bears. Since they rarely have fresh water to drink living in an Arctic sea ice environment, this is really important, and that fat plays a really important role. Another adaptation, they're a really compact ears and really short tail, which helps them to reduce heat loss. You think of it as sort of the opposite of like an African elephant who has really big ears that it fans in the heat to cool down. Polar bears have these tiny little ears. They're close to their body, covered in fur to maximize insulation. Polar bears are really good swimmers. They're not as good at swimming as seals are, but long-distance swims are growing more common as ice retreats from the continental shelf in some parts of their range. This can be really taxing, as you might imagine. It takes a lot more energy to swim than it does to walk. And since the Arctic is rarely calm, you can imagine these swims are often in challenging conditions. The longest swim that we have a record for was a collared female that swam for 9 days, over 425 miles in the Beaufort Sea. One thing that's propelling them forward when they're swimming are these big paws. Polar bear paws are ideal for getting around the Arctic. They're huge. They're up to the size of a dinner plate. It helps them walk on thin ice without falling through, great for swimming. They're sort of like paddles, doggy paddling in the water, and their hind paws serving as rudders. The bottom of their feet on their foot pads, they're covered by these small soft bumps known as papilla, almost like a small basketball bumps that help grip the ice and give them traction, keep from slipping. Also tufts of fur between their toes that provide traction and also warmth. They have thick, curved, sharp, strong claws. Each claw is about 2 inches long, and they use their claws to catch and hold slippery seals and to get more traction on the ice. Polar bears have famously great senses of smell. They're able to smell a seal from great distance, up to 2 miles away, and carcasses for even farther away than that. They have a long nose, which allows the air to warm up a little bit before it hits their lungs, and a ton of surface area inside their nasal cavity to really, really sniff out their prey. In the wild, adult polar bears live about 15 to 18 years, with females living a little bit longer. There's been a few of those ones that tagged in their early 30s. Those were female bears. Thanks to these amazing adaptations, these blubber hunting sea bears can live a really long life. The longest bear in human care was at the Assiniboine Park Zoo in Winnipeg. That bear's name was Debbie, and she was 42 years old, so they can live a real long life. Now, polar bears, as we've mentioned already, most at home on the sea ice, where they're hunting ice seals like bearded seals and ringed seals. They're usually going to be at leads in the ice or breathing holes where seals are coming up, and they're like an ambush predator just waiting there patiently for one to surface. They need to eat a lot of seals to power those big bodies. During the winter, they're averaging a seal a week and eat up to 100 pounds in one sitting. just a lot of energy. Like I mentioned, they're going to like sneak up on the seals at the breathing holes. The seals are their favorite food because of that thick blubber layer. Ice seals have a big, thick layer, and that blubber has a lot of calories to power and sustain polar bear bodies. A lot of older bears that are more experienced seal hunters don't even eat the whole seal. They'll just eat the blubber and leave the rest for Arctic foxes or ravens or other scavengers to take advantage of the leftovers as a free meal. My colleague Elisa calls them, and I think they truly are, a blubber hunting ice bear. Because energy conservation is really the name of the game for polar bears. They eat as many seals as they can, but even their hunting style is low energy. It's an ambush hunting style where they're waiting patiently at that breathing hole and jumping on the prey, or perhaps even going to a ice den or snow den where seals have their pups, and they may collapse that to look for them as well. Now, all of these incredible adaptations make polar bears perfect fits for sea ice ecosystem in the Arctic. So let's talk a little bit about sea ice. So a little short video on how both polar bears and seals use the sea ice.
Polar bears rely on sea ice to efficiently catch their main prey, ice seals. Although seals can outswim polar bears in the water, bears have the edge on top of the ice, using it to sneak up on and stalk their next meal. Ice seals and other ice-dependent species rely on sea ice for survival too, using it as a platform to rest on and for giving birth to and raising their young.
While seals are filled with blubber that polar bears love to eat, it's all about the ecosystem they live in. This next short video kind of talks a little bit about how this ecosystem works, and then we're going to dive into it a little bit more.
Sea ice is to the Arctic ecosystem as soil is to the forest. When ocean water gets cold enough to freeze, it expels its salt, causing channels to form in the ice. Algae grow within these channels and form the base of the food chain. Algae feed the tiny organisms like zooplankton that inhabit these waters. Arctic cod feed on them, seals eat Arctic cod, and polar bears prey on seals.
So, as Elisa mentioned in that video, sea ice is as important to the Arctic as soil is to the forest. It's really the basis where the sea ice algae can get purchased and create the basis of this whole food chain. The sun's energy and photosynthesis, as well as the nutrients from the water, help to create a supercharged algae that stores its energy as lipids. So a lot of plants on land store their energy as sugars. You think of maple tree, and we can harvest the syrup from the sap to create syrup. Carrots, potatoes, berries, all of these plants are storing their energy as sugars. Now, some on land store it as fat, as lipids, thinking like sunflower seeds or nuts like walnuts or cashews. This sea ice algae that gets a lot of purchase underneath of the ice after the salt falls out. It's right up there at the surface of the water. It's hitting where the light is. The water's constantly rushing through those little fissures, creating fresh nutrients to go by. And it's this algae is storing its energy and growing in lipids. The diatoms are going to start feeding on and copepods on this algae. And then through bioaccumulation, as it moves through the ecosystem, as it moves through the food chain, the fish are eating the copepods, like Arctic cod, the seals are eating the fish, and then, of course, polar bears are eating the seal. This is a photo of some of that sea ice algae. You can just see how prolific and green and bright and vibrant it is. Now, this, like I mentioned, this whole ecosystem is just another illustration similar to the video that we watched, all driven by a lipid-rich ecosystem. It's caused some polar bear scientists to, instead of referring to them as carnivores, referring to them as lipivores, which is a little bit made up, but it's also incredibly accurate when you think about what the foundation of their diet is. Polar bears are eating the blubber of these seals, and it's because of this sea ice ecosystem that they're able to have this seal of food item available to them. Now, sea ice can vary greatly in thickness and age, flow size, concentration, depending on the influences of temperature, currents, and wind. And so for this reason, some sea ice offers better hunting conditions than others. And as a result, polar bears are distributed in the Arctic relative to the nature of the ice in shallower, more productive seas. Thicker, multi-year sea ice doesn't let in as much light, which can limit algae productivity. And it's also usually in deeper, less nutrient-dense parts of the ocean. So let's talk a little bit about what polar bears do when they aren't on the sea ice. They're instead on land. Now, this is the same view that we saw earlier, the map on your screen now. And the moving image to the left, this is showing sea ice extent. So annually, the sea ice changes, as you might imagine, right? In the winter, it's far more extent like right now. And then when the image changes and it's a smaller concentration of white ice right in the middle, that's the summertime. And that's what polar bears are seeing, what we see in the summer months. And so you might expect some of these, like at the bottom of your screen there, you can see Hudson Bay. In the north, like kind of the left-hand side of your screen, you're seeing Alaska and how that sea ice changes throughout the year. Now, again, this is the same look on the North Pole that we saw at the start of the presentation. And a lot of bears, some of those that live the furthest south in this image, live in seasonal sea ice ecoregions. They come on land in the summer and fast because there isn't ice to hunt from. As you can see, it melts in the summertime. Now, this map from the IUCN Polar Bear Specialist Group illustrates how polar bears are distributed across the North. These 20 subpopulations are genetically and behaviorally distinct, and bears pretty much stay in the area where they grew up. They have really long childhoods, sticking with their mom for about 2.5 years, so they really learn how to hunt effectively on the ice where they grew up. Like I mentioned, they're not evenly distributed to these areas, but they concentrate where their prey is most available. And this changes throughout the year, but seals need to breathe air, so polar bears will most often be found along those open leads and ice edges where seals are going to breathe and haul out. Now, this area circled here is the Western Hudson's Bay subpopulation. It's one of the longest studied populations of polar bears and is part of that seasonal sea ice ecoregion. Now, in these seasonal sea ice ecoregions, the ice melts every year. And those bears are used to a feast and fast cycle. Bears, even outside of these regions, are often forced to feast and fast throughout the year. They come on land when the ice melts each summer and fast. And in the fall, they gather at the shore, eagerly waiting for the ice to freeze so they can get out and hunt seals all winter and spring. When you think of other bear species holding up and conserving energy, you probably think about like brown or black bears who den up when it starts to get cold, right? They get snug and they're resting all winter, conserving energy. Polar bears are sort of the opposite. Winter is the best time for them. They're out on the sea ice hunting as many seals as they can. They don't hibernate, but in the summer, when they come on shore, they take it really easy. They're hanging out, trying to conserve as much energy as they can while living on those fat stores from when they were feasting. They're waiting for it to get cold enough for the top of the water to freeze up so they can go out and hunt seals again and start that cycle over. And polar bears are totally evolved for this feast and fast cycle, one of the many cool adaptations they have to survive in this really harsh environment. They're all about conserving energy from their digestive system, being really highly efficient at metabolizing blubber, something like 90% efficiency at metabolizing blubber, far less efficient at metabolizing like carbohydrates or proteins. To their fur, to their gait, their ambush hunting style, they're experts at holding on to their energetic resources. In the 1980s, bears in Western Hudson Bay were spending on average of about 107 days on land, fasting, waiting for the sea ice to return. By 2015, that number increased to 130 to 135 days, about a month longer. When you think about the time difference, like that's really maybe 2 generations of polar bears. So they're spending about a month longer on land than their grandparents did. So really fast timeline when you think about adapting to a changing environment. This year in Churchill, Manitoba, where we do a lot of work in Western Hudson Bay, the sea ice breakup was on June 19th. So bears made their way to shore and were waiting, conserving energy until it was cold enough for the ice to start forming, which happened around November 26th, which was about 160 days. While they're used to fasting each year, the longer it is, the more taxing it is on them and really pushes the limits of their biology. The Arctic is warming 4 times as fast as the rest of the planet. In places like Hudson Bay, this is reducing the amount of time that polar bears have to hunt seals, forcing them to rely on their fat stores for longer periods. Already in parts of the Arctic, longer ice-free seasons and longer fasting periods have led to a decline in polar bear populations. You can think of it like the atmosphere like a blanket that surrounds the Earth. When we burn fossil fuels like coal, oil, and methane gas for energy, we add more and more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. This buildup thickens that blanket, trapping in excess heat, raising our global temperature, and disrupting the climate. This translates to earlier breakup and later freezing of sea ice, impacting polar bears' ability to access their prey. So this information can be hard to take, right? Because it's important for those who speak about the status of polar bears to wrestle their way through what it really looks like for a population that's experiencing increased mortality. The Western Hudson Bay subpopulation has seen a 50% decrease since they started doing population surveys in this region. Some of the really important impacts to highlight are cub recruitment. So if the mother doesn't have enough energy to raise her cubs, those cubs are going to be able to survive to adulthood, which is what recruitment is. It's like adult animals replacing themselves, recruiting into the adult population. So young bears making it to adulthood. It impacts their denning sites. It impacts the size of bears themselves, as well as the number of bears in a population. It impacts seal denning areas, and seal having a really successful denning is important to polars to be able to have a really successful hunting season, as well as distribution changes down the food web of like Arctic cod being displaced. So what can I do? We get this question understandably a lot. And there's 3 types of climate action that we tend to direct people towards. We want to focus on carbon dioxide emissions. So programs and actions that will reduce or eliminate our carbon dioxide emissions are key. That's where energy shift and energy efficiency come into play. We're not just talking about the individual things that many of you are likely already doing, like reducing single-use plastics and turning off the lights when you leave a room. We encourage people to do those things, but then to keep looking towards larger existing programs and opportunities in your community that you can join in on. Policies that come across your ballot box that you can vote for, and things like community gardens or community solar that shift the responsibility from an individual to more systemic carbon impacts. But also talking about it is just as important. Research tells us that the majority of people in the US are concerned about climate change, but they're self-silencing because they're convinced they have the minority opinion. They're also nervous about talking about it because they're not sure that they can do it correctly. So if we can empower the majority of people who are already concerned about climate to start talking with their friends and families, we can really turn the tide on this misconception and really start mobilizing for change. I like to remind myself that the answers are out there. We know the problem, we know the solution, and we have the tools available to take action. Now, some of these innovations are in their infancy, and some of them are growing and changes faster than any of us expected. We also have alternative energy options, many of which are expanding faster than we anticipated. Climate scientists have given us considerable information on the viability of green energy, and there's hope in knowing that we have the tools and the ingenuity to make it happen. It's a matter of scaling up and making these options available to more people in more places. And you are uniquely positioned to have an outsized impact on your sphere of influence. You're a trusted messenger, so you can talk to people about it. It's safer than you think. Now, concern for the climate is normal, and reducing our emissions of heat-trapping gases is the solution. we can come together as a community to address climate change by bringing it to the forefront of our conversations, talking about it. And the more we do, the more we'll identify actions to help ensure the sustainable choice is the easy choice for more people. We don't want the planet to get too warm. We want it to function exactly as it should, with a thriving sea ice ecosystem, fat fish, fat seals, and very full polar bears. I have just one more video to show, and then I'm excited to answer any questions that you may have, where my colleague Elisa wraps this all up in a really succinct way.
Future generations of people and polar bears depend on the decisions and plans that we make today. A polar bear's life cycle is almost exclusively tied to the sea ice. Because polar bears rely on sea ice to hunt, to breed, and sometimes to den, sea ice loss from climate change is their biggest threat, and the reason the bears are listed as vulnerable on the IUCN's Red List of Threatened Species. What we learn about climate change impacts on polar bears in Hudson Bay can be applied across the Arctic to help conserve other populations. Climate change is already affecting some populations of polar bears. Since we get most of our energy from fossil fuels, we are producing huge amounts of carbon dioxide. You see, regular amounts of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere act like a blanket around the Earth, trapping heat and keeping our planet at a stable temperature. However, when we burn fossil fuels like coal, oil, and natural gas for energy, we pump rampant amounts of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. This buildup thickens the blanket, trapping too much heat, disrupting the climate, and melting Arctic sea ice. When Arctic waters are cold enough, the top layer freezes into a special type of ice called sea ice. Sea ice is to the ocean what soil is to a forest. It supports the entire Arctic food chain. Food from this marine ecosystem also sustains northern communities. The key to getting the climate back to functioning the way it should, and to preserving a future for polar bears across the Arctic, is to move away from using fossil fuels for energy altogether. The most important thing we can do is vote with the climate in mind to let our leaders know we support a swift transition to renewable energy sources. In the meantime, we can directly participate in and learn more about our local and regional renewable energy options. We can all make a difference outside our own households by influencing where our energy comes from. Because together, we can make sure that polar bears roam the Arctic sea ice for generations to come.
Thank you so much for having me here today. I'd love to answer some questions. And I also have an email popped up there on the screen, questions@pbears.org. So if you have a question after we're done today and you would like to follow up, or if there's anything you had a specific thing you'd like follow up on, please feel free to drop us an email at any time. And we also love to stay in touch. You know, we have a little bit of a choose your own adventure approach to email newsletters. But if you scan this QR code, it's an opportunity. You can kind of customize the type of content you'd like to get, whether you're an animal lover or a conservation minded or an educator. You can sign up for curated inbox content. In the worst case scenario, you get a few cute polar bear pictures in your inbox. So if that's something you're interested in, feel free to scan that QR code.
I'll get a scan there. All right. Thank you very much for the great presentation, Kayla. I've got a question here that was just submitted. What is the most important takeaway you hope we remember after learning about polar bears today?
I hope that you appreciate how perfectly adapted they are for their sea ice habitat, how crucial that sea ice is for their survival, and that we're hopeful for a future for polar bears. I think sometimes polar bears are the poster children for bad news when it comes to climate, but we're incredibly hopeful for the future of polar bears, and we know that we have the tools. And so I hope you walk away also feeling empowered moving forward.
Okay, great. Another question. since polar bears are so uniquely adapted to marine conditions and living on the sea ice, how can those conditions best be replicated in captivity by zoos?
That's a really great question. And I think one that's shared by a lot of folks who see images of polar bears. Here, I'm going to stop sharing for a moment so that you can see me talking to you a little bit more directly. I would never pretend to be an expert on polar bear husbandry in a zoo setting. But like so many animals, when they are in the wild, they don't have access to nutritionists or to round-the-clock vet care. And so you see a lot longer lifespan for bears living in zoos. A lot of really creative and capable keepers and curator staff have worked to provide enrichment for all of the animals in their care, but thinking of ways to replicate that ambush hunting style that polar bears have, as well as giving them a lot of choice when it comes to temperature. They're really so resilient. One picture of a polar bear sleeping on the rock in the presentation, I took that a couple years ago up in Churchill in the fall. It was probably 65 degrees that day. Polar bears are, though we see them on ice and they are so adapted for really cold temperatures, they can also be quite comfortable when it's warmer. So I think that in a zoo, they can replicate a lot more of that than maybe we think at first glance.
No, that's very good. I'll throw in a little additional zoo perspective is that a lot of what's been learned by the biologists about the natural history of polar bears, we don't have polar bears here at Greenville, but other colleagues that work very closely with other facilities that have polar bears and work with PBI actually doing a lot of field work. For example, like the transmitter that was integrated into the hair, that's a great partnership between zoos and field biologists of what can be learned to help the survival of a species in a special circumstance like a zoo where we can do that type of a test, if you will. And additionally, like Kayla mentioned about sort of the ambush hunting or certain aspects of hunting in animals in managed care, we do a lot of environmental enrichment, so we can provide some of that for the animals that we have in our care. So we take their welfare very seriously, and so a lot can be done to help make their well-being great, and also contributors to their wild counterparts. They kind of help each other out that way. Another question that came in was this individual was curious about the main effects a decline in the polar bear population would have on the ecosystem. What effects their decline would affect?
That's a good question. One that we thankfully don't have a ton of data on. As you might imagine, polar bears notoriously difficult to study, being a white bear on a vast white landscape. So getting a sense of if you remove this apex predator from that environment, what are the impacts that we're going to see? We have models that are similar, within other habitats, but we don't really have an Arctic habitat model for what that would look like. Hopefully we don't find ourselves in a situation where we have areas that are without polar bears. But if we did, then we would likely see some of those. There are, in some areas of polar bear range, they overlap with other bear species. And if a polar bear, which is much larger than other bear species, would be to be removed in some areas of the subarctic where they move into the boreal forest at times, we might see some habitat shift there. If we're seeing habitat shift where it was previously getting colder and then that's moving up in northern latitudes, then we're going to probably see in the wake of that a change of the habitat itself. So maybe areas where there were polar bears that's just not suitable habitat any longer, other bear species may move in. But it's a good question and one where time will tell.
Okay. I'll throw in a question with the the changes in sea ice and the the warming effects that you're seeing. I know you said there's the distinct genetic populations up in different areas. Have you noticed any, with those changes, any genetic drift, especially the margins, that might indicate there's some shifting of individuals due to the need to move, literally?
Yeah, but what we've seen, especially in the more southern subpopulations, the males especially tend to move a little bit more between them than the females do. But young female bears tend to return to similar denning areas, and sometimes within a couple 100 meters, they'll dig a den to where the den that they grew up in. So they're really learning that landscape and how to survive and where to go and what time of year to be there. So they have a lot of high site fidelity when it comes to returning home, especially the females. Males, a little bit more fluid. When we think about, like, could you transplant a bear? I know this wasn't your question, but, we have bears like in Southern Hudson Bay. If we moved one to the Beaufort Sea, or if we moved one to Svalbard, like, could we, sometimes I get the question, like, could we just move bears? Because they're so site specific and really learning to thrive, it's unlikely, since the ice dynamics are so different in different parts of the Arctic, it's unlikely that they would be able to survive there. And these areas that we're talking about are pretty large, right? So just to simply get from one subpopulation to another, that's a pretty big investment of energy from a bear to move. Should trends like accelerate or continue, maybe we'll see some more movement, but it's likely that we would just see an overall population decline.
Okay. If anybody else has questions, certainly feel free to throw them into the chat. I've got another one. The field biologists and veterinarians that may be working with the bears when you're tagging them, putting transmitters on them, are you doing some health assessments on them for any particular diseases? And for example, like the fat that they may have, are they biopsying or taking some fat to look for any kind of residue of any type of pollutants or toxins?
That's a good question. If there was a researcher with a specific program looking at that, like asking those questions, they likely would, but that's not usually part of the standard workup. Usually they're taking just a hair sample and a blood sample, and maybe like a tooth sample. They have like one really small tooth that they will sometimes remove. And that's usually most of the biological samples that they're taking. They're going to get measurements, of course, of the bear, but I don't know if unless it was a specific study regarding energetics and fat, it's not usually one that they're collecting every time.
Okay.
There has been some work having to do with pollutions and bioaccumulation in bears, but yeah, there's like usually one-offs.
Okay. No, thanks. I think we've gotten all the questions answered, so appreciate the good questions people have submitted, and thanks for joining in. Kayla, thank you for providing such a informative talk and getting everybody excited about polar bear conservation. And I just as a reminder, we will have this recording available in the near future, so keep tabs on the website, or we may try to make it available on as far as a notification on Facebook, like we did the lectures. Keep tabs on Facebook, our Facebook, for any upcoming lectures. And thanks again, and everybody have a good night.
Thanks, everyone.